The voice of sovereign Kethvaras filled every speaker on every human ship, station, and colony at the same moment. There was no warning. There was no introduction. There was just the voice, deep, slow, and completely sure of itself. You have 30 cycles to surrender. Your colonies will become Vreth territory. Your military will be dissolved. Your people will serve under Vreth governance. This is not a negotiation. This is a schedule. The transmission ended. On the Galactic Conclave Assembly Station, 300 diplomatic representatives from 40 species sat in complete silence. Some of them had heard that voice before. They knew what came after it. 17 species had received that voice, and 17 species no longer existed as free peoples. Commander Ilara Voss sat at the Terran table. She was a small woman with short gray hair and steady brown eyes. She did not look alarmed. She did not look afraid. She looked like someone who had just been handed a piece of paper with the wrong answer written on it. Her aide, a young man named Owen Clark, leaned close. "Commander, should I prepare a response draft?" Ilara did not look at him. She was still watching the empty space where the transmission had played. "Tell them we decline," she said. Owen blinked. Just that. Just that. The Vreth ambassador across the hall, a tall scaled creature with 4 eyes and a chest like a stone wall, turned slowly toward the Terran table. He had expected tears. He had expected pleading, or at least a request for more time. What he saw instead was a woman already reaching for her communication device, already moving to the next task, as though the most powerful empire in the known galaxy had just told her the weather forecast, and she had found it mildly inconvenient. He did not understand humans yet. The rest of the galaxy watched. Most species present assumed it would be over quickly. The Vreth Dominion controlled 42 star systems. They had a fleet that could darken a sky. Their soldiers stood 2.5 meters tall and had been trained for war since birth. Humanity had 12 colony worlds, a mid-sized fleet, and about 400 years of recorded space travel. The math was not in humanity's favor. But math was not the only thing in play. Ilara Voss left the station within the hour. She gave no interviews. She held no press event. She boarded her shuttle, opened a secured channel to Earth, and said one sentence before the channel was encrypted. "Activate Iron Shepherd." The response came back in less than 10 seconds. "Confirmed, Iron Shepherd is active." Back on Earth, in a command room 3 levels underground in the city of Geneva, Admiral Leon Farrow set down his coffee and looked at the wall of screens in front of him. Maps, fleet positions, supply routes deep inside Vreth territory, intelligence files that had been building for 15 years, quietly and carefully, without a single public announcement. He was 61 years old. He had spent the last decade and a half preparing for a war he had hoped would never come. He was not happy that it had come, but he was ready. He turned to the room of officers behind him and spoke quietly. "Everyone knows their assignment. No speeches. Get to work." They got to work. Across the Terran Union, things began to move. Ships listed as inactive in maintenance logs were suddenly fully crewed. Supply depots that had been recorded as offline in public records turned out to be very much online. Soldiers who had completed classified training programs in the last 3 years received new orders and packed their equipment without telling their families where they were going. None of this was visible from the outside. That was the point. On the Conclave station, the Vreth ambassador filed a report back to his God King. He described the human response as arrogant and foolish. He predicted that when the first Vreth fleet arrived at the edge of Terran space, the humans would change their answer quickly. He was partially right. The humans did change their answer. They made it shorter. The Vreth fleet crossed the border marker 12 days later, fully expecting to find a line of human ships waiting to negotiate. What they found instead was empty space. No fleet, no station, no signal. Just silence. The Vreth fleet commander sent a scan report back to his superiors. Nothing. The humans had not even come out to meet them. He assumed this was fear. He moved deeper into Terran space. It was not fear. It was patience. Back in Geneva, Leon Farrow watched the Vreth fleet's movement on the screen and said nothing for a long moment. Beside him stood a younger officer named Grace Dunn, who had written her doctoral thesis on Vreth military strategy and had spent the last 6 years making sure Iron Shepherd accounted for every part of it. "They are moving faster than the projected timeline," she said. "Yes," Leon said. "Does that change anything?" He looked at the screens. 40 Vreth warships, moving in a confident formation, heading toward the colony world of New Carthage. "Tell Osai to be ready 3 days early," he said. Grace was already reaching for her comm unit. On a troop transport somewhere in the dark between stars, Staff Sergeant Dara Osai received a single message. It had no greeting and no explanation. It said 3 days early, you know what to do. Dara read it once. Then he folded it, put it in his pocket, and went to tell his unit. They did not ask questions. They had trained for this. They knew what was coming. They just did not know yet how deep it would go. The Vreth fleet arrived at New Carthage expecting resistance that would last maybe 3 days. The colony had a population of 600,000. It had a small orbital defense grid that the Vreth disabled in under an hour. Their ground transports landed in the open fields north of the main city, and their soldiers marched toward the settlement with the calm confidence of people who had done this before. The first street was quiet. The second street was quiet. By the third street, the Vreth unit commander began to feel uneasy. There were no people running. No one was visible at windows. The buildings looked empty, but the doors were all closed. The commander ordered a thermal scan. The results came back almost immediately. The buildings were not empty. Every structure in the city had people inside it. Hundreds of people. They were not hiding. They were waiting. The first device went off under the road at 600 hours. It was not large. It did not need to be. It flipped 2 armored Vreth carriers and blocked the road entirely. Within 40 seconds, every entrance to that street was sealed. Vehicles pushed across intersections by remotely operated machines. Debris dropped from rooftops with careful timing, and the Vreth unit found itself in a box. Then the doors opened. New Carthage had not evacuated because its people had chosen to stay and fight. Civilians who had completed civil defense training, former soldiers, young people who had grown up hearing about Iron Shepherd in whispers and had spent the last 3 years quietly learning how to act on it. They were not soldiers in uniform. They were farmers and teachers and engineers who had decided that if the Vreth were coming to their home, the Vreth were going to earn every single meter of it. Dara Osai was not in New Carthage on that first day. He was watching from a tactical feed on his transport, but he watched every hour of what followed, and he did not look away. The Vreth had expected New Carthage to fall in 3 days. It took 3 weeks, and the Vreth never fully held it. In space, the situation was equally confusing for the Vreth commanders. The Terran fleet did not form a battle line. It did not gather at a strategic point and defend it. Instead, small fast groups of Terran ships appeared without warning at the edge of Vreth supply convoys, hit them hard, and vanished before escort ships could respond. The Vreth lost 17 supply vessels in the first 4 days, then a fuel depot near the border relay, then a communications array at the outer edge of the Dominion's patrol range. The Vreth fleet commanders had no name for this kind of fighting. In their entire history of conquest, the species they had faced had always tried to defend something, a planet, a station, a fleet formation. The humans were not defending anything. They were everywhere and nowhere at once, and every time the Vreth moved to chase one group of ships, another appeared somewhere else. A Vreth fleet captain named Vorzith sent a private message to the God King's War Council. In it, He wrote something that none of the other commanders had wanted to say out loud. He wrote, "They are not afraid of us. They are not trying to survive this. They are trying to make this painful enough that we leave. I do not think we have enough ships to make them stop." The message was not well received. One of the Terran frigate captains, a man named Felix Ward, had taken his ship on a long curved course around the back of the Vreth main fleet formation. The Vreth did not detect it until the ship was already accelerating directly toward one of their largest warships. The frigate struck the Vreth dreadnought on the port side just below the main engine block. The explosion was visible from two other Vreth ships. Felix Ward survived. His ship was destroyed, but he and 11 crew members reached an escape capsule. Before the hatch sealed, he opened a broad transmission and said, in a voice so calm it was almost casual, "New Carthage is still ours." Those 4 words spread through every human ship, station, and colony within the hour. Back at Vreth High Command, Sovereign Kethvaras received the battle reports and felt something he had not experienced in over a century. Not quite fear, something close to it, a sense that the ground beneath his certainty had shifted without his permission. He made a decision that he believed would end it. He ordered the bombardment of Hesper's Rest. Hesper's Rest was not a military colony. It had no meaningful defense grid. It had a university, 3 hospitals, a farming network that fed nearly 500,000 people, and 2 million residents who had come there looking for a quieter life at the edge of Terran space. When the Vreth fleet appeared above it, there was no battle. The colony sent a signal identifying itself as non-military. The Vreth fleet acknowledged the signal. Then it opened fire anyway. The footage reached Earth 6 hours and 14 minutes later. The Terran War Council had been in continuous session for 9 days. When the footage played on the screens in the briefing room, the room went completely silent. Not the silence of shock. These were people who had been following every hour of the conflict. Not only grief, though grief was very much present. It was the silence of people who had just made a decision without needing to speak it. Admiral Leon Farrow watched the footage for a long time. Then he looked across the table at Commander Ilara Voss, who had returned to Earth 2 days earlier and had not slept more than 3 hours since. Her face was completely still. "They wanted us to beg," she said. No one answered. "They are waiting for a message asking for peace terms." She stood slowly. "We are not going to send one." The vote that followed was not about retaliation in the usual sense. It was not about striking Vreth cities or advancing across their border worlds. It was about something more specific, more deliberate, and in a way the rest of the galaxy would only understand later, far more final. The vote was to make Kethvaras himself the single objective of the entire remaining war. Not his fleet, not his capital city, not his military command structure. Him. Iron Shepherd, which the wider military had understood only as a large-scale war plan, now revealed its true design. For 15 years, a small team of Terran intelligence officers had been building a single file. They called it simply the map. It contained the location of every Vreth relay station, every patrol route near the capital world, the exact schedule of the God King's personal guard rotations, the structural layout of his palace, and the one narrow navigational corridor through Vreth space that was never patrolled because every Vreth commander assumed no enemy ship would ever be quiet enough or patient enough to use it. Grace Dunn stood at the front of the room and walked the council through it. She was 34 years old and had spent 6 of those years making this presentation ready. Her voice did not waver. "We do not need to win the war the way they expect us to fight it," she said. "We never did." A senior council member asked the question that was in every mind in the room. "Can we actually get someone into that palace?" Grace looked at the screen, at the corridor, at the map. "We already have 1,200 people selected for the attempt. We have a ship that can make the crossing in 18 days without being detected. We have plans for every guard position and every internal door in that building. We have been ready for this moment for 3 years." The silence that followed was different from any that had come before it. It was the silence of people who had just realized that the plan they were being asked to approve had been waiting for them, had been built specifically for this day, long before the Vreth ever sent their ultimatum. The vote was unanimous. On the troop transport where Dara Osai's unit was stationed, a new set of orders arrived. They were pulled from the new Carthage theater. They were given new equipment and a new briefing, and for the first time, the full shape of what they were being asked to do was laid out in front of them. Dara sat with his unit in the cargo bay and listened. When the briefing officer finished, no one spoke for almost a full minute. Then a young soldier named Ivy Cole, who was 22 years old and had joined the military 8 months before the war started, said quietly, "We are actually going to do this." It was not a question. Dara looked at her. "Yes," he said, "we are." The ship was called the Unbroken. It carried no heavy weapons. It had been coated in materials that scattered sensor signals and built to move at a speed that kept its heat signature below the threshold of Vreth long-range detection systems. 1,200 soldiers were packed into its lower decks for 18 days. They slept in shifts. They trained in the corridors. They ate cold rations and spoke in low voices and watched the countdown clock on the wall. The corridor through Vreth space that Grace Dunn had identified was narrow and completely dark. It took the Unbroken within range of 2 patrol stations, both of which the ship passed at minimum speed with every non-essential system powered down. The crew on the bridge sat in the dark and did not speak during those hours. The ship moved through the corridor like a breath held in a chest. On the 18th day, Vethkara Prime appeared on the forward sensors. The capital world of the Vreth Dominion, gold and green from orbit, wrapped in a ring of orbital stations and a fleet of warships that circled it in slow, confident patterns. They were not going to the fleet. They were going to the surface. The descent capsules were small enough to read as debris on Vreth atmospheric sensors. 12 of them dropped from the Unbroken's lower bay over a 4-hour window, each angled slightly differently, all aimed at a landing zone 4 kilometers from the palace in an uninhabited stretch of low hills. Dara's capsule hit hard. The harness caught him, and he was out the hatch before the dust had settled, moving toward the tree line while the capsule's built-in system quietly burned itself to ash behind him. By the time all 12 units had assembled at the rally point, they had been on Vreth soil for less than 40 minutes. The palace was visible in the distance, a massive structure of dark stone and blue-lit towers, surrounded by walls and guard stations, and 100 years of confidence that nothing like this could ever happen. A soldier named Ben Marsh pulled up the interior layout on a small screen and handed it to Dara without a word. Dara studied it for 30 seconds, then handed it back. "Same as we trained," he said. "Nothing changes." They moved at night. The outer wall had been the hardest problem in the planning phase. It was patrolled constantly, with no interval longer than 90 seconds between guard passes at the east approach. The solution had taken 2 years to develop. It involved specific tools, precise timing, and 12 people moving in complete silence across 40 meters of open ground. They made it. What followed inside the palace walls was not fast. It was slow, careful, and demanded full focus at every second. The guard positions were exactly where the maps had placed them. The internal doors were sealed in the pattern that intelligence had confirmed 18 months earlier. The team moved from room to room, level to level, without making a sound that carried beyond the next corridor. Dara lost 2 people in the inner wing. Not to a trap or an alarm, a guard patrol had shifted its timing by 4 minutes. He did not stop. He had told his team, and believed it himself, that stopping was the one thing they could not afford to do. They reached the throne chamber on the 3rd level. The door was 3 meters high and built from a material that had stopped every conventional cutting tool in testing. A specialist on the team, a quiet and precise woman named Cora Blake, had spent 14 months developing something that was not conventional. She had tested it in a replica chamber built underground in northern Canada and had never missed her window. She did not miss it now. The door opened. The room beyond was large and lit in dim blue light. At the far end, behind a raised platform of carved stone, stood Sovereign Kethvaras. He was enormous, nearly 3 meters tall, scaled in deep gray, with eyes that caught the blue light and held it. He wore no armor. He had not expected to need it. He had been the most powerful individual in 42 star systems for over a century, and no one had ever come for him before. He looked at the soldiers standing in his doorway and spoke in translated Terran. "You are aware of what you are doing." It was not a question. His voice was deep and completely calm. Dara stepped forward. "We know exactly who you are," he said. "That is why we came." Kethvaras studied him for a long moment. Then he looked at the soldiers arranged in a careful pattern across the chamber entrance and understood, in that moment, that they had planned for every response available to him. There was no move he could make that they had not already mapped. He had, at the end of it all, made one critical mistake. He had assumed that humanity, like every species he had ever faced, had natural limits on how far it would go. He had not considered that a people given 15 years to prepare, and a reason that large to use them, do not carry limits into the room. The restraints were placed on his wrists without ceremony. Dara opened the secure channel. "Iron Shepherd is complete," he said. On the bridge of the Unbroken, the pilot, a composed woman named Nina Harrow, closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Then she opened them and began the extraction sequence. The transmission reached every corner of the known galaxy within 6 hours. It was not a declaration. It was not a speech. It was a video feed broadcast on an open channel from the colony of New Carthage, and it showed one thing. Sovereign Kethvaras, God King of the Vreth Dominion, ruler of 42 star systems, walking in restraints through the streets of a human colony he had tried to take 3 weeks earlier. He was alive. He was unharmed. He was walking under the open sky, surrounded by Terran soldiers, on a street that had been a contested zone not long before. The buildings around him still showed the marks of the fighting. Some had no roofs. Some had been partially rebuilt overnight by residents who wanted the street to be recognizable for this moment. The people of New Carthage lined that street in silence. Not in anger, not in celebration, in silence. They watched him pass. Farmers and teachers and young people and older ones. People who had defended their homes without uniforms, who had made the Vreth pay for every meter of ground they had tried to claim. They watched with the steady, serious expressions of people who had done something very difficult and were not yet finished processing what it meant. Walking beside Kethvaras, 1 step back and to his left, was Commander Ilara Voss. She did not look at the cameras. She did not look at the crowd. She looked forward, her face composed and her hands still, and she walked at a steady pace that left no room for any interpretation other than the one she intended. "This is what it costs to come for us." The transmission played on screens in the Galactic Conclave Assembly Station, where 40 species watched without speaking. It played on Vreth warships still positioned in Terran space, where commanders sat very still for a long time after receiving it. It played on the colony worlds of the Terran Union, where people gathered around screens and felt something that was not quite pride and not quite relief, and was perhaps something for which no clean word existed. On a transport returning from Vethkara Prime, Dara Os watched it on a small screen in the medbay, his left arm wrapped from wrist to shoulder in medical dressing. He watched the entire feed without moving. When it ended, he nodded once slowly and looked up at the ceiling. Ivy Cole was in the bunk across from him, watching the same feed on her own screen. "Did we know it was going to look like that?" she asked. Dara was quiet for a moment. "Someone did," he said. The Vreth Dominion sent a request for peace negotiations within 72 hours of the broadcast. The message was formal and careful, and used the traditional Vreth phrase for a ceasefire request, a phrase that had never before been directed at a species as young as humanity. Alara Voss received the message in a small room at the Conclave station. She read it twice. Then she wrote a reply and sent it before finishing her coffee. The reply said that the Terran Union would accept negotiations. The terms had already been written. They were not written by the War Council or the military command. They were written by the surviving families of Hesper's Rest. The negotiations lasted 4 days. The Vreth representative who sat across the table from Alara Voss was a senior diplomat who had spent 20 years working in interstellar law. He was careful and intelligent, and had clearly been instructed to agree to whatever was placed in front of him. On the final day, before the agreement was signed, he asked one question. What does the Terran Union want in exchange for releasing the Sovereign? Alara reached into the folder in front of her and removed a single document. She slid it across the table. The Vreth diplomat looked down at it. It was the original ultimatum. The one Kethvaras had broadcast across every open frequency 37 days ago. The document that had demanded humanity's surrender, its colonies, its military, and its future. Across the bottom in plain text was a single word. Declined. The diplomat stared at it for a long moment. Then he picked up the signing pen without another word. In the months that followed, the Conclave received 12 separate diplomatic contact requests from species that had not spoken directly with humanity in years. Some were small and cautious. Some were warmer than expected. A few came from species that had been watching the Vreth for a long time and had been waiting, quietly, to see if anyone would ever do anything about it. Leon Farrow retired 4 months after the war ended. He issued a short written statement thanking his staff, acknowledging by name the people of Hesper's Rest, and nodding that Iron Shepherd had been built on the work of hundreds of individuals whose contributions would never be made public. Grace Dunn was appointed to lead the newly formed Terran Strategic Intelligence Division. Her first briefing to the division was brief. It contained no threat assessments, no projections, and no timelines. It contained one sentence. We never stop watching, and we never stop preparing. Dara Os returned to New Carthage when his medical clearance came through. He had grown up on that colony. He walked down the same street where the broadcast had been filmed and stood on the same ground where the fighting had been heaviest. A shopkeeper he had known since childhood came outside and stood beside him for a moment. "Were you there?" the man asked. "At the palace?" Dara looked at the street. "I was somewhere," he said. The shopkeeper nodded, as though that was a complete answer. Maybe it was. The galaxy did not become a peaceful place overnight. It never does. But something had shifted in the way other species spoke about humanity in the years that followed, not loudly, not in formal speeches or official conclave records. In the quiet and careful way that people speak about something they do not fully understand but have decided, firmly, not to test. Humanity had not won because it was the largest power in the galaxy, or the oldest, or the most feared. It had won because when it was given 30 cycles to surrender, it had said no, and then it had worked quietly, patiently, and without a single announcement for 15 years, and then 18 days across enemy space, to make that answer mean something permanent. The stars did not care. The stars never do. But the species that lived beneath them remembered. And they did not forget.